Hello, welcome back to Curve&stitch. Today's tutorial is one you've been asking for. A beautiful shirred waisted top that's comfortable, flattering, and surprisingly easy to sew. The dramatic gathers, relaxed fit, and fitted waist makes this top perfect for jeans, skirts, shorts, or even the barrow pants we recently made on this channel. In this video, we will go through step by step from drafting the pattern to cutting, shirring, and sewing the entire top. So grab your tools and let's get started. For this project, you will need fabric, matching thread, elastic thread for the shirring, sewing machine, fabric scissors, pins or clips, measuring tape, ruler and curve ruler, then your iron. Since this top is very easy to sew and cut, we are not going to draft this on a separate pattern paper, but rather we are going to draft it directly on the fabric. Start by folding your fabric on the clockwise grain, just like so. Make sure the fold is enough to accommodate your shoulder plus your sleeve plus any necessary seam allowance you will need. Then pin like so. From the top edge of your fabric, measure and mark 1 inch on several points. Then draw a straight line to use as your start point and also the shoulder guideline. Now on the shoulder guideline, measuring from the folded edge, measure and mark half of your across shoulder measurement. After the across shoulder measurement, measure and mark your sleeve length measurement. So in this case, I'm using 8 inches for my sleeve length. Then on the sleeve length measurement, go down by 1 inch to create the shoulder slope, just like so. Then join the shoulder slope mark to the across shoulder measurement, just like so. Now we need to create the neck. So measuring from the shoulder line on the folded edge, measure and mark 2 inches, just like so. Then on the shoulder line, you can either measure from the across shoulder mark 1 inch in, or you can measure from the center front to the shoulder mark, then you subtract 1 inch from it, just like so. Because I want a little support on the shoulder, so I'm just leaving 1 inch on the shoulder so that it will hold the sleeve on my shoulder. So this will create something like a boat neck. Now join this point, the 2 inches point, to the mark on the shoulder to create the front neck, just like so, using the curved side of your ruler. Now measuring from the shoulder guideline, measure and mark your bust point measurement. So in my case, mine is 9 inches. So I'll measure and mark 9 inches on several points. Then I'll square a line to use as my chest line or the bust point line. Now we need the under bust line. So measure from the shoulder guideline, measure and mark your under bust length measurement. So in my case, mine is 13.5 inches. So I'll measure and mark 13.5 inches on several points. Then I'll square a line to create the under bust line, just like so. Now on the bust point line, input your bust measurement. So the bust measurement we are going to input is our bust circumference times 1.5, then you divide it by 4. The additional measurement is to make allowance for the shirring of the waist side. Now we need to create the sleeve opening line. So on the bust point line or on the chest line, input the same measurements you have on your shoulder line. So it will be half of the shoulder plus the sleeve length. So the measurement you input is the whole measurement you have up to the sleeve length measurement. You input that same measurement on the bust point line. Then connect the shoulder slope line to the chest or the bust point line to create the sleeve opening, just like so. On the under bust line, input the same measurement you have on the bust point line, which is your bust times 1.5 divided by 4. So you input the same measurement on the under bust line. Now we need the length of our top. So I'm going to use 25 inches for the length of the top. So measuring from the shoulder, I'll measure and mark 25 inches. Then I'll square a line to create the hem line or the top length line, just like so. Now we need to create the side seam for the top. So I'm going to use the curved side of my ruler to join the sleeve opening line or the bust point line to the under bust using the curved side of my ruler, just like this, to create the side seam for the top. On the hemline, input the measurement you have on the underbust on the hemline. Then use the straight side of your ruler to connect the underbust line to the hemline to create the side seam for the top. Now we need to determine where we want to start our shirring from. So in my case, I'm starting from the underbust line. So measuring from the shoulder, I will let the shirring stop at about 18 inches from the shoulder. That's 4.5 inches from the underbust. So that's the width of the shirring I'm going to make. Now to create a guide for the shirring, I'm going to divide the 4.5 inches into half inches. So measuring from the underbust, I'll measure and mark half inch until I get to the 4.5 inches or the end of the shirring. Then I'll connect these points to create a guideline for the shirring. You have to extend this line through the waist of the top. So after drawing this line, I will turn the other side of the top, then extend this lines so that the line will extend to the full top. After drawing my guidelines, this is what I have. As you can see, I've extended it to the other side of the top. When you are creating this line, make sure you do it on the right side of the fabric. So use something that can easily be cleaned. So it's either you use a tailor's chalk or a heat erasable pen. So in my case, I'm just using a heat erasable pen to create this line. Now we need to cut the back part of our top. So fold your fabric just like you folded for the front. Then place your front part, that's the folded front part, onto the fabric, making sure to match the folded edge of the front to the folded edge of your fabric, just like so. Then pin it in place. Then trace everything except the neckline. You can cut the neck depth the same way you cut the front, but in my case, I'm just going to use 1 inch neck depth for the back. So I'll trace the whole front on the fabric except the neck. Then I'll create the neckline just like so by measuring from the shoulder guideline 1 inch. Then I'll connect it to the 6 inches mark to create the neck depth for the back, just like so. Go ahead and cut the back part of your pattern just like so, following the exact cutting line for the front, just like so. When you are cutting the back part, notch where the shirring line starts and where it stops so that it will be easier for you to transfer the shirring lines to the back of the top. After cutting the back part, go ahead and cut neck facing for both the front and the back to use it to finish the neckline. Sorry, my camera stopped recording whilst I was cutting the neck facing. So in another video, I'll try and then incorporate how to cut a neck facing for any neckline. Then go ahead and draw your shirring lines just like you did for the front, just like so. Before I start shirring, I'll indicate my hem allowance. So fold it and then iron it in place. But if you like, you can go ahead and hem your top, because after shirring, the top will shrink, which makes some of these things a bit difficult. So if you want, you can hem your top now, but I'm not going to hem it now because I want the hem to conceal the side seam. So I'll just create the guideline now, then I'll hem it later on. I'll also go ahead and attach my neck facing to the neckline of the top. So to attach your neck facing, place the right side of your neck facing to the right side of your fabric, just like so. So right sides together. Pin it in place, making sure to match the neckline of the two fabric pieces together. Then pin them in place, just like so. Do the same for the other piece of the top. Now we are going to start our shirring. So to do that, you need to wind your elastic thread onto your bobbin by hand, just like so. You should not use your machine to wind the bobbin, as it will overstretch the elastic thread. Now we need to prepare our machine so that it will be able to create the shirring effect. For a brother sewing machine or for my machine, you don't have to drop the bobbin in just like you do for normal thread. If you do that, your machine will not be able to create the shirring effect. It will just sew a loose stitch on your fabric without shearing. This happens because an elastic thread is a bit bigger than the normal thread, so the machine is not able to automatically put it in the tension dial or the tension of the machine. So you need to manually put it in the tension of the tension board to be able to create the tension the elastic needs to be able to shear. Now, to access the tension dial for the bobbin, you need to first remove the bobbin cover just like so. Now we are going to remove the whole top plate on the machine. So pull this little button forward just like so, then pull your plate forward or towards you to remove it just like so. Now remove this black, which is the bobbin case, and also where the tension for the bobbin can be located. Now place your thread inward just like you place it when you are placing any normal bobbin in your machine. That's making sure that it is creating that P letter. Then put your elastic into the tension dial manually just like so. Then pull your thread to make sure that it have the tension required. Now, as you can see, this white stain on the bobbin case should match that white stain where that boat is. There's a white stain on the boat, so make sure to match the two whites. That's how you place it. Put back your cover just like so, then cover the bobbin with the bobbin cover just like so. Now you can use your hand pedal to bring your bobbin thread up just like so. Now the bobbin part of your machine is ready to shear. Now, depending on the effect you want for your shearing, choose the stitch length on your machine based on the shearing effect you want. So in my case, I want to have the maximum shearing that my machine can give, so I'll go for the highest stitch length, which in my case is 5 millimeters. So I'll take my machine to 5 millimeters. For my upper tension, I don't need to do anything to it, as my machine is okay to shear with the standard tension or top tension. So mine is on 4. Now start shearing. When you are starting your shearing, start with your normal stitch length, which in my case is 2.5 millimeters. So I'll just stitch just a few centimeters, then I'll back stitch to lock the stitch. Then I will take my stitch length to the maximum, which is 5. Then I'll keep shearing. When you get to the end of the row, make sure your needle is in. Then pivot your machine to the next line. That's, I use my standard stitch, which is 2.5 millimeters. Then when I get to the row, the beginning of the row, I take it back to my 5 millimeters. Then I'll stitch to the end. I'll continue doing this until I finish the whole rows. So I'll do it off camera, as I don't think any of you want to watch me sew straight stitches. So I'll do it off camera. Then I'll bring the shirred fabric for us to continue what we are doing. My shirring lines, I left ½ inch from the edge of the side seam so that the shirring will not extend to the side seam. That's my seam allowance for the side seams. So I didn't share the side seam allowance, so that it will be easier for me to join the side seam later on. After I'm done with my shirring for both front and back, I'll change my bobbin thread to a normal thread. Then I'll finish the neckline. That's, I'll sew the neck facing to the neck of the top. So after attaching the neck facing, this is what I have. I went ahead and added hemming gum to the neckline so that when I press it, the neckline will lay very flat. Now go ahead and clip your seam allowance, then trim off some of the seam allowance to reduce some of the bulk in the neckline. Repeat the same process for the other neck part of the top. Push the remaining seam allowance to the facing part of the top, then edge stitch it in place. After edge stitching, this is what you have. Take it to your ironing board and press the neckline to have a smooth neckline just like so. So after ironing, this is what I have. Repeat the same process for the other piece of the top. Now we need to join the shoulder seam. So we are going to use French seam to finish our seams. So I'll place my fabric wrong side to wrong side. This is opposite of what we normally do. So the wrong side of the back will be facing the wrong side of the front, just like so. Now take your shoulder seams, then pin them in place just like so. Take it to your sewing machine and sew using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do the same for the other side of the shoulder seam, so you sew using 1/4 seam allowance. After sewing, this is what I have. Now go ahead and trim your seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Do the same for the other side too. Now flip your fabric, that's right side to right side, just like so. Then pin the shoulder seam that you've just sewn and trim to get a nice seam in the inside of your top, just like so. So do it for both sleeves, then take it to your sewing machine and sew using 1/4 inch seam allowance. After sewing the 2 shoulder seams, this is what I have. Now you can take it to your ironing board and press the seam nicely so that they'll all lie flat and nice. Now we need to sew the side seam of the top, so we are going to flip it back out again, wrong side to wrong side, that's right side out, just like so. Then we will pin the side seams from the hem of the top to the armhole, just like so. Do the same for the other side seam. Then take it to your sewing machine and sew using 1/4 inch seam allowance, just like so. After sewing the side seam, trim off the side seam to 1/8 inch seam allowance. Do the same for the other side of the side seam. Then flip your fabric wrong side out, just like so. Pin your seam allowance again using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then take it to your sewing machine and sew. After sewing the seam allowance too, this is what we have. Now we need to hem the bottom part and then the sleeve part of the top. So use the folded edge you have or the guideline you created to fold your hem all around. So you fold 1/2 inch. So in my case, I'll fold 1/2 inch, then 1/2 inch again. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and sew. Then for the sleeve too, I added 1 inch hem allowance for the sleeve. So I'll fold it 1/2 inch, then I'll fold it again 1/2 inch. Then I'll pin it, take it to my sewing machine and then sew the hem of the sleeve. I'll go ahead and give the entire garment one final press, and that's it. Your beautiful shirred waisted top is finished. If you enjoyed today's tutorial, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to Curve&stitch if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future pattern drafting and sewing tutorials. I love to know in the comments if you'll be making this top. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. If you love this top, you'll definitely love this pair of barrel pants. This pair perfectly together, and I'll show you exactly how to draft and sew this from scratch. Click here to watch next.